Now let's take some time to look at advanced sketch entities. First, we want to expand the display pane, then we want to hide our sketch. So now that our sketch is hidden, we can select the top plane and start a new sketch. On our new sketch, we're going to look at a few of the advanced sketch entities, namely splines, ellipse, slots, and polygons. Let's start with splines. There are three different types of splines that you can deal with. The first is a standard spline, the next is a style spline, and the third is an equation-driven spline. For the purposes of our series, we're not going to talk about equation-driven splines. We're simply going to talk about a regular spline and a style spline. Let's start with the standard spline. To create a spline, you want to start with a first endpoint and at least one other endpoint. Now, if we simply hit escape at this point, we end the spline. When you select the spline, you notice that you see some gray entities. There are a few arrows and endpoints. When we grab these, we can move them around and we can change the shape of the spline. The endpoint is going to allow you to change the weight of the handle and the direction. The arrow pointing in the same direction is going to allow you to adjust the weight of the handle. The double arrow is going to allow you to adjust the direction. These spline handles allow you to create lots of different curvature just by simply moving them around. You'll also notice that once you activate the handle, it'll turn blue. You'll notice that the handle on the right-hand side is still gray because we haven't selected it yet. And when we move this around, you'll notice that its weight changes based on the rest of the curvature of the spline. This is simply to create the least amount of tension in your spline. If we look at the properties, you'll notice that it says under define because we haven't added any dimensions or relations yet. We do have some available options for relations such as horizontal, vertical, or fixed, in this case for this specific handle. As we scroll down, you'll notice that we have show curvature, maintain internal continuity, and there's a for construction option. This is currently grayed out because we have the handle selected. If we were to select the spline, you'll notice that this gives us the for construction option. If we select show curvature, we have some options here. We can adjust the scale and the density of the curvature combs. Once we say OK, you notice that it displays the curvature combs in the background. This is very handy because it allows you to take a good look at what the curvature is doing and if you're adding any bad geometry. Now, when we're dealing with things like a standard spline, you need to have at least a start and an end point, but you can have multiple points in between. If we create a new spline, you notice that we can use these endpoints to create the curvature we want. But there's a cautionary tale here, because each one of these points will have their own spline handle. Now, if you start to move these around with all the internal points, that's fine. But if you start to adjust the curvature of some of these internal handles, you can get into a bad situation real quick where the curvature of the spline is very bad. Let's go ahead and show the curvature, and we'll reduce the scale to make it a little bit easier to see, and take a look at what happens when we start moving these handles around. So you can see there's a lot of curvature on this spline. You notice that we have a very nice smooth transition up here and a couple smooth transitions here, but then we get into a sharp transition in this corner, and we have sort of this deviant hump in the middle here. Now, if we start activating more handles, it becomes a much worse situation. You notice that we have a bad point here where we zoom in, and it gets worse as we go down the line and start activating more and more handles. Now, if you need a spline that has a lot of geometry such as this, you might want to look into using a style spline. You notice that when you start a style spline, you have a few options. You can use a Bezier curve or B-spline in degree 3, 5, or 7. Now, these options are new for SolidWorks 2016. In the past, it's been a standard Bezier curve. Let's go ahead and start with a Bezier, and we can look at the differences. Now, when you're creating a style spline, what you're actually doing is you're creating a control polygon for the spline. Now, as we start adding these points, once I hit escape, you notice that we're not controlling handles on the spline, but we have these sort of endpoints, which are part of a control polygon. And you move these points around, and that's going to give you the curvature of your spline. Now, if we show the curvature of this, it gives us a pretty nice curvature right off the bat. When we're using a style spline, if you select it, you notice that we have the curve type option where we can change it from a Bezier to a B-spline of 3, 5, or 7 degrees. When we're talking about B-spline of degree 3, 5, or 7, it really has to do with the number of internal points. You can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 internal points, and we have 8 points total, counting the endpoints. So this gives us a curve of degree 7. This allows us to select degree 7 as one of our options. If we select these endpoints and we delete them, It's reducing the number of control points that we have. And again, if we select the spline, you'll notice that now it's a curve of degree 5, and the dropdown no longer includes a B-spline of degree 7. If we say OK and we create a new one, let's go ahead and just by default select degree 7 and start creating it. Now once we hit escape and we select it, you notice that it automatically goes to a B-spline degree 3 because we didn't add enough control points, and the dropdown doesn't have the options for 5 or 7. In this case, if you want to add more control, you right-click and you say Insert Control Vertex. What you want to do is you right-click and you're going to place a control vertex along one of these edges. So you notice as I add more points, it adds more control. And these points stay along the same line where we're adding them, but then you can move them around and manipulate them a bit more. Now we select the spline, we have the option for a degree 7. You'll notice that it changes the curvature of the spline. Using a B-spline of degree 3, 5, or 7 will ultimately give you a much smoother result. You can add many different control points to control the curvature, but the end result is going to be a very nice smooth curve that you can use to create your complex parts. Let's go ahead and take a look at a few more options. The original spline we created, if we right-click on it, we have the option to do several different things. We can add tangency control, curvature control, we can insert spline points, we can do several different things in here, you'll notice, all the way down to convert to style spline. We convert to style spline, we get a warning that tells us it's going to be an approximation of the original curve. Then we can decide if we want to use a Bezier, or if we have enough control points, we can select a B-spline of 3, 5, or 7 degree. Once we say OK, now we've converted this original spline into a style spline. And just like before, we can right-click and we can insert more control vertices and change the degree of our spline. So now when we select it, we have the available option to use a B-spline of degree 3. Now, splines in general are very complicated, and you have to be very careful when you talk about creating splines, because what you want to do is make very solid foundation for your parts. Once we get into creating some actual parts, we'll talk a little bit more about how to define, dimension, and constrain our splines. But for now, it's just important that you understand that there are several different types of splines and different ways that you can control them. Let's talk about a few of the other advanced sketch entities. Next, let's talk about ellipse, and I want to show you the drop-down here. We have parabola and conics in there as well. Let's start by creating an ellipse. We'll start with a center point ellipse at the origin, and we'll drag out to the left. First thing we need to do is set the width in one direction, and then the width in the other direction. Now, one very important thing when we talk about these is how they're defined. Nothing is going to be fixed until you add relations or dimensions, so you have the ability to move them around and manipulate them to whatever shape you need. Let's take a look at the next option, partial ellipse. Now, when you create a partial ellipse, you simply do the same starting procedure. You give the center point, you give one of the endpoints, the second endpoint, and then you can drag the curve around. So this is a great way for you to define the same type of geometry, but not have to create an entire closed profile. Next, let's take a look at some of our other options. We have parabola. Now, when we define a parabola, we zoom out, you can see that it's already starting the preview on the screen. You create a point for the change in curvature, you select a point on the end, and then you drag the distance of your parabola. They can be kind of hard to create, so you often want to create some reference geometry before you start creating a parabola. But of course, once everything is underdefined, you can still move these points around and change the way they affect the curvature. You can always select a point and fix it as well, and we'll talk about relations in a little bit. Lastly, let's talk about a conic. Now, there are some options here for conics. We have auto tangency, which we can turn on or off, and we can make it for construction. Pretty much any geometry in a sketching environment can start as construction geometry. When we start to create a conic, you'll notice that we start by drawing a straight line. You'll also notice that there's a midpoint on this line. Once we select the endpoint of this line, you'll notice that we start by creating a curve. Now, this curve is essentially a slice of a cone in 3D. Now, once we select that point, then we need to determine the row value. Now, the higher the row value, the sharper the transition in the corner. The lower the row value, the more gradual the transition is. Now, of course, you can define these as well by adding dimensions, but right now we're really just focusing on what geometry gets created. Next, let's take a look at slots. There are several different types of slots, and I'm not going to cover all of them here because they're fairly straightforward, but I do want to talk about the difference between a straight slot and an arced slot. So let's start with a straight slot. You'll notice again that when we select this, inside of the property dialog, we can change which type of slot we're creating. We can automatically add dimensions, and we can determine whether it's center to center or overall length. It's going to be very handy if you're determining the slot based on geometry of a bolt or fastener that needs to go in it, or if you simply want to determine the center to center distance. Let's start creating our slot. If we select the starting point, an end point, and then we determine the radius value. You notice that it automatically created the dimensions even though I didn't type anything in. At this point, I could double click on dimensions and I can manipulate their values if I so choose. Next, let's take a look at one of the arc slots. In this case, I'm going to do a center point arc slot. You'll notice again in the picture that it starts with the center point of the curvature. The second selection is the start of the slot, the end of the slot, and then the radius value. So let's start here. We'll drag up, and you can see that we created an arc slot. And again, we use the add dimension option, so now we have a fully defined slot, which is simply free to move around in the environment. If we determine a fixed point on it, you'll notice that it's no longer fully floating in the environment until we completely fix it. Let's go ahead and delete all of this and talk about the last thing in here. And this is going to be a polygon. Polygons are very handy to use because you can determine how many sides you need. In this case, let's say 5. We can determine if we want an inscribed circle or a circumscribed circle, and we can start creating it. We'll start at the origin and we'll drag a line up. So you'll notice that here with the inscribed circle, we have a construction circle on the inside that has a tangency with every straight segment and it intersects at their midpoints. If we do a circumscribed circle, you notice that we have a circle, again construction geometry, that intersects all the endpoints or the intersection points between the lines. We can also go ahead, as we're creating this, and manually manipulate the values as we go. So you can start by sketching it out and modify the values. In this case, we could create a triangle very quickly and easily if we wanted to do things like cut threads or add some geometry that would be harder to sketch automatically. Now, when we create these, again, they are underdefined. They're free to float around until we start adding a few relations. Again, we will talk about relations in our own video. I just wanted to mention that we need to fix these inside of our sketching environment before we can really move forward.